You have questions? We have answers. Welcome to the Therapist Question Box with your host, Miss Lindsay Schiss.
Hi, this is Lindsay Schiss, and I am your host of the Therapist Question Box, where we are here to answer your toughest questions. So ask away. Today I have with me Grant Helt, who is the clinical director at Therapy Utah. And Grant and I actually usually work on the management side. So it's fun to talk a little shop talk with you today.
Yes, it is.
Happy that you're here, Grant.
I'm happy to be here. You've been asking me for a while. So I'm glad
and I finally convinced you to come on.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Glad you're here. So Grant, tell us a little bit about you.
So anticipating that question, I realize it's kind of wild to say this, but I've been doing therapy now for about 10 years, which feels like it's just flown by. And my journey into therapy, I had a professor in grad school that would say, research starts with me search. And that was like totally true for me. So as a kid and into like middle school, I had like really severe anxiety. And so my path into like becoming a therapist was a lot about like figuring myself out and trying to understand that and like what worked and what didn't for me. And it's just grown from there. And so kind of the journey into like what I specialize in now is in my young career, I was meeting with a lot of individuals and couples that were working on pornography use or broken trust, infidelity in the relationship. And the tools that I had just weren't cutting it. It was like, I had some things to talk about marriage and relationships, but I pretty quickly learned like there's got to be more. And so I found the two co-founders of Therapy Utah. They had a blog and a podcast at the time, and what they were saying just really resonated. It was so useful, applicable, but also their approach to it was very safe and unshaming, which really resonated with me. So when I saw they were interviewing all those years ago, like I could hardly contain my excitement.
Wow.
And I'm really glad they took a shot on me because I remember showing up for that interview. I don't know if I was going for like a Sigmund Freud motif or what, but like I had like a tweed jacket and a tie. And when you know our culture, it's like, that's not really
right.
But
you were thinking therapist. You got to look the part, right?
Yeah. And luckily they were able to kind of see through that veneer and it's been amazing. So
it's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. You've been a huge asset at Therapy Utah. You're now the clinical director and have, a lot of expertise that have been invaluable to the rest of the team. So it's awesome to have you here.
Thanks.
Well, today we are going to really be talking about infidelity and trust repair and we hope at the end of this episode that our listeners will learn what to do after betrayal and really what trust looks like. So I'll just launch right into the question and then we'll go from there. Here's the question. I recently found out my partner cheated on me. They say it was a mistake and want to rebuild our relationship, but I don't know if I can ever trust them again. How do I know if it's possible to move forward, and what does real trust repair look like after betrayal? So first of all, I read this question and I thought, boy, that's a really tough one, and appreciated this listener's willingness to be vulnerable and to talk about something that's one of the most painful experiences a person can have. So first of all, I just want to offer that. The second is just, let's talk about betrayal in general. What is betrayal? Because, we may have a lot of listeners listening that have not maybe experienced this type of betrayal, but maybe have had other betrayal. So can you talk a little bit about that? Absolutely.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when we hear that word betrayal, our mind goes to sexual infidelity, which is definitely a form of betrayal. In couples like work, there's a principle that when a relationship is really thriving and a couple has high satisfaction, one of the things they do really well is they turn towards each other. So when things get hard, they go to each other for that comfort. When things are good, they celebrate that with each other. And so when you start turning away, that erodes trust because you don't feel like I can count on that other person to be there for me. They don't share in this experience with me. But betrayal adds a layer to that. It's not just turning away, it's turning away and toward another thing. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can experience that. Like you can feel that with other forms of sexual infidelity. So pornography use, online behavior like chat rooms, things like that. You can also feel it with like an emotional affair or an attachment where my partner is turning towards somebody else for that connection rather than to me. Financially, if there's financial secrets that are kept, that can be a betrayal. And additionally, just having maybe somebody whose opinion you value over that of your partner, especially when it comes to issues that directly impact the relationship. So it's not an exhaustive list, but there's a lot of different ways that you can feel betrayed. And I think what we're going to talk about today definitely applies to any of those categories.
Exactly. And I think that's helpful because there's betrayal on a lot of levels and in a lot of different relationships. And certainly this is one of the most painful ones, right? I love that you said it's turning towards somebody else, turning away from your partner, turning away from that attachment figure, and then turning towards somebody else, which is so painful.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, Grant, I know you've worked with so many couples in the past. How do you know, when does a couple know if it's even possible
that's such a good question.
To move forward?
That's such a good question. So, I would say there's a few elements. One of them is the level of contempt that exists in a relationship. So what I mean by that is there's a certain attitude towards a partner that really gets in the way of doing the recovery work. And if I back up a little bit to kind of shed a little bit more light on this, getting to the punchline of the question, it's absolutely possible to rebuild trust. It absolutely is. It is not easy. Like, it's a process and it requires a lot of patience and a lot of effort. And so if I'm showing up with my partner in a way that there's a lack of respect for them, I'm looking down on them, that really gets in the way of having the humility needed to go through that process and do that work. That's one of the biggest indicators, I think, of whether this is going to be worth putting in that time and effort. And
so when you say that, is that for both partners?
Yes and no. So yes, like that contempt does go both ways. However, it really makes a lot of sense, and we might get into this a little bit later, but there are some things that to really look out for, especially I would say, like, it's really important to have a therapist to help work through this process. It's just such a critical thing to have somebody there to support you and your relationship through this. And one of the mindsets to kind of be aware of, kind of a red flag to look out for with a therapist is if there's this attitude of like your anger is pushing your partner who betrayed you away. It's not okay to be angry. It absolutely is. And it makes a lot of sense that there's that anger. And a lot of times what I tell betrayed partners is that kind of adopting an adapted golden rule is a good way to look at it. So the golden rule, do unto others is you would like them to do unto you. The adapted version for a betrayed partner would be do unto others as they do unto you. That doesn't mean that if you're being treated with disrespect and like to throw that back. But what it does mean is if I'm in a relationship with somebody who's sincerely doing the work and like their heart's in it, it's hard, but they're really trying, then my part is to try too, if the relationship is something that I want to save. If they're showing up and not doing the work, still holding me in contempt, showing up disrespectful to me, then it may not make sense for me to put all my effort into trying to save the relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The question that comes up for me with that is, how do I know if they're doing the work? Like, how do I know their heart's in it? Because what if they're just going through the motions because they don't want to lose the partnership? Yeah. Like, how do I know? And does the motive matter? What do you think?
Yeah. So, I think there's several things that are kind of checkbox things. Like you can do these things and check that box off that like, hey, I'm going through those motions. So, it could be tasks like, hey, I'm going to therapy, box checked, right? What you're looking for is more of being able to kind of step back and see like, what's at the heart of the energy behind how they're showing up with this work. So like, for instance, it's one thing if I see my partner doing things that I've maybe given them a list to do. Like, I would like you to read a book. I want you to go to, some form of therapy, and they go through that list, and that's good. Like, okay, they're following that. It's another, if you can kind of step back and see they're taking some initiative. Like, they're doing some things that I haven't necessarily asked them to do, but are really good for their healing. So they're the ones looking for a therapist to meet with. They're the ones that are researching, like, what are some good resources for me to learn more about this process. So when you see that initiative, that's a really good indicator.
I think that's so important that the initiative is being taken. And the other piece is, as you were talking, I thought, you don't want to be the policeman, to be monitoring, engaging, and saying, here's your checklist. Okay, did you do it? That becomes a parental relationship as opposed to a partnership. That's not what you want.
Right.
So when they take initiative and say, this matters to me, recovery matters to me, and even if maybe the partner were to die, right, the next day, that they would still be interested in recovery outside of the partner saying, this matters to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Well, so I'm wondering what do you feel like the steps of trust repair are? And we can just start with initial. How do we repair that trust? You said, allowing the partner to be mad matters, right? The betrayed partner has every reason to be mad, and it's justified. How do you start rebuilding trust when there has been a betrayal?
Yeah. So I want to answer that question. I want to step back real briefly just to come back to really having a therapist to work through that process. It would kind of be like trying to perform hip surgery through the DIY route if you don't have somebody that's really there to help support through it. And who's there helping to support matters. And so I mentioned like one red flag. I just want to name a couple others to kind of look for. So if you are meeting with a therapist that kind of takes the position of shared culpability in what happened. Like, it's both partners have a responsibility in what occurred. That's not a really good attitude to have towards the therapy. And I would say, like, with any of these indicators, it's better probably to move on, like find somebody that doesn't approach it with this attitude. So there's that. Another is putting an artificial timeline on when you're supposed to heal. So if there's this attitude of like, okay, it's been X amount of time, really, you need to make your mind up within this next amount of time if you're going to forgive him or her or not. It takes the time that it takes.
Yes. Do you find that with partners as well? Like,
yes.
Okay, I'm going to give myself this amount of time, and by this time, if I'm going to be in or out, and I'm going to know that.
Yes.
And that's just really hard to gauge.
Yep.
And you're saying if a therapist puts a time frame on it, it's a real red flag.
Yes, it's
Absolutely.
a real red flag.
Okay.
Right. Then the last big one is let bygones be bygones. This happened in the past. Let's move forward. You already know, like, it needs to be talked about. So with that, I think we can segue into maybe the process of what that looks like.
Yeah. So again, can trust be repaired? So I appreciate that really therapy is necessary.
Yeah.
Like, it is absolutely necessary. And I would agree with that trying to repair and get to a trusting place and even a healthier place is going to be almost impossible to do it without a third party's help. But being really conscientious about the type of therapist you choose,
yes,
and some of their values around this matters as well. Yeah. So let's launch into, what does rebuilding trust look like?
So the approach that I like to use may differ from therapist to therapist. That's okay. The attitudes that we just talked about is the key thing. But the way that I look at it is, I mentioned earlier that I met with some couples early on in my career that I felt like I wasn't well equipped for. Most therapists, especially couples therapists, understand how to do what we call attune and attach. So that's, how to connect emotionally, connect physically, and have healthy attachment with each other. The key that's missing, that's such a huge part of rebuilding trust and healing from betrayal, is the first part of this process, which is referred to as atone. So you have atone, attune, attach.
Atone, attune, attach.
Yes.
Okay.
Is the process through it.
Okay.
Atone's a big word. Oftentimes, it can conjure up images of suffering and death, and like it's difficult, but really what that refers to is making amends. And we can talk about what that atone phase really looks like and the individual components that go into that. Would that be okay to jump into that?
Sure, yeah.
So a big one to start that atone phase is confession. You might hear the word disclosure used here too. It's really being able to have complete honesty about what's happened and to have it all out on the table. And again, like having a therapist to support working through like what real honesty looks like and what questions to ask is super helpful here.
Yes. And you and I have done a disclosure together. We've helped a couple through a disclosure, and it is a painful process. It's painful for the couple. It's painful for the therapist. And how important do you feel like a disclosure with full transparency is?
It's essential. In fact, there's some research done with couples that were really open to that process of being fully transparent and going through a disclosure-like process, and couples that were closed off to it, right? Maybe I shouldn't say couples, individuals that were like, I don't really want to do that with my partner. I don't want to disclose what's happened. And what they found is that the couples who were willing to go through that and to ask questions and get the answers, there's like an 86% rate of their marriage succeeding moving forward. That number dropped to like 59% for couples that were not willing to have a disclosure process.
Huge difference.
Huge difference.
Yeah. So painful, but if we're looking for full trust and repair, then this is a really important step. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so attuning is the next step.
Yeah, well, so there's some things with that atone. So you have confess and that disclosure. But then there's a couple other things that are really important before we get to attunement, which are showing true remorse and behavior change. So that's where we talked earlier about like, I'm looking for what are they actually doing to work on this and to change, and is it coming from a sincere place? That's also where like some verification needs to happen there. Sometimes betrayed partners will be told like, don't be controlling, which is kind of a tricky one because there's some truth to that like you mentioned, I don't want to police things. But at the same time, like as I'm working through this process, I need some verification. And so if I'm the couple that's betrayed my partner's trust, I need to step into some willingness for that like it's okay for them to check on my location. It's okay for them to check up on my phone records, or like they need to see that in order for some trustworthiness to return. And then after that behavior modification or behavior change, I should say, the next piece in it is really understanding what went wrong. And if I'm the partner that betrayed your trust, why I'm choosing to stay with you. Like that's a really important question for a betrayed partner to understand. Like, why do you want to work this out with me? Why are you choosing to stay in this relationship?
Why is that so important?
Because that's what's really like imploded in the partner's
the choice to stay with them.
Yeah.
Yes.
And a betrayed partner is really going to be asking that question of like, what didn't I have that, right? And so really being able to understand like, this is hard work. Why are you choosing to stay in this relationship with me? Really helps to answer that question.
And I think the word that's so important is choose.
Yes.
I mean, this is what the betrayed partner is saying. You didn't choose me. Yeah. You chose somebody else, right? You chose something you turned away from. So why are you now going to choose me? What is going to make you choose me tomorrow and the next day and the next day?
Yep.
Right?
Right.
So I appreciate that choice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So to attune, how do we attune?
So attune happens like that atone phase moves into attune when the betrayed partner feels willing to step into beginning to forgive. One of the myths is that you have to forgive him or her before progress can be made. That's not true. It's just that I'm seeing enough in that atone phase to say I'm willing to open the door to that. Once that happens, you can move into attune. If you move into that earlier than that, it's going a little bit too fast for the relationship or the individual healing of the partners. So once that's ready, moving into attune is really looking at, I shared earlier that a red flag with with a therapist that somebody might be working with is like looking at shared responsibility. There's a difference between that and some of the work that happens in the attune stage, which is looking at what wasn't working in our relationship that created disconnection between us. That doesn't give a right for a partner to wander from the relationship, but that's part of the attune stage is what do we want to create that's new in this relationship? What are our needs emotionally and otherwise that we can start working at meeting better moving forward?
That's so important, that distinction, that it's not, okay, look what she was doing, so he decided to do this or vice versa. But it's saying, really, there was something off in the relationship. So let's honor that and get honest with ourselves about what wasn't working. It does not justify behavior, but it's showing up in honesty about actually what was not working.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. Anything else with attune?
As the name implies, like it's learning to be more attuned, meaning I can anticipate my partner's needs. I'm getting more connected with them. We're really working on that turning towards in this part. Like, what were the things that got in the way of being able to turn toward each other? How do we repair that so that moving forward, that trust can build that you're going to be there for me?
Gosh, and as I listen to that, I think that is a painful process, I would imagine, frankly, for both parties, but certainly the betrayed partner.
Absolutely.
Turning toward after you have been betrayed and saying, okay, here I am, vulnerable again, let's do this.
Yeah.
I mean, that takes a tremendous amount of courage just to do that.
Yep. And that's why it's so important that atone stage gets all the time that it needs. And there's no pressure. There's no timestamp on this is when we have to move into attune. It's when we feel like there's sufficient safety to be willing to move into that next process, because it is really hard. And you know what? And it's okay moving into that. Sometimes couples need to step back a little bit and maybe revisit some things. That's okay. We need to have patience for that. Because what you're saying is absolutely right. It's a very vulnerable thing that you have to see that my partner is showing up with some trustworthiness in order to feel safe to approach that.
I love that reminder. Like there are steps here, and trying to go through one quickly so we can wrap this up and get out of this yucky, hurting, horrible, painful part does not work.
Right.
Because you're not going to be able or willing to feel safe to turn towards if there's really some of that groundwork hasn't been laid of the atonement stage. Okay. All right. Last stage is attachment.
Yeah. And I won't say so much about this one. It gets even more vulnerable. So attach is really where the couple's working on what oftentimes is one of the most vulnerable, potentially most triggering parts of reconnection, which is reconnecting sexually. A huge thing after a betrayal, especially one of a sexual nature. And so in that stage, it's really looking at, now that we have the safety of the atone stage, the connection of the attunement stage, and the trustworthiness that's been built there, now we can move into more intimacy, more into that space. So it's really looking at the couple's attitudes around sex and a lot of the same ways with the attune stage, like really being able to figure out like what our sexual connection means to us as a couple, what we want it to create for us in our relationship, what's okay and what's not. And that, for obvious reasons, is the last step. Like that takes a tremendous amount of safety to be able to step into that space and really start looking at building that in a way that feels much more connecting.
Yes. And that both partners are willing to show up in that way and willing to be honest about that. Yeah. Again, I'm so appreciative that you talked about those steps and that there's no time frame on this either, because I think, again, sometimes that attachment and intimacy can feel like, oh, I've got to do this, or we need to be intimate sooner than later because maybe that will help, or that will keep the partner engaged, or that'll keep her or him, wanting to be in the relationship. But boy, I would imagine that could be a real detrimental choice to make if it's done too soon.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Too vulnerable.
Yep, that's spot on. And those conversations can happen even before that attached stage of just like, what are some of the ways that maybe we've used sexuality or any kind of connection to try to prevent those things from happening? And how do we reclaim that as something that can actually be a positive experience for both of us,
Yeah.
right? Rather than one that we're using to try to manage our anxiety
Yeah.
or numb a feeling or prevent an outcome that we don't want.
So good.
Yeah, absolutely.
So good. I'm curious as we've had this discussion, how often do you feel that you have seen a couple after betrayal has happened that they have a hard time trusting in the world in general?
Yeah.
I think as a woman that when I go out into the street, I am kind of putting on a guard. My safety is not probably the same as yours. I would actually say for sure it's not the same as yours.
I would agree.
And so if in my most intimate relationship, that safety has changed, like that's the one place that should be safe no matter what. And when that safety is breached, does it change the way I'm able to go about the world? Like, I just wonder if my safety and it is shattered, like my reality feels like it's been shattered. So I'm just curious, dealing with that from a therapeutic perspective. It's not just in the relationship, but in the way that the betrayed partner goes about in the world.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet that I think is really important to highlight with this is like when you go through betrayal, like really what you're experiencing is PTSD, like it's trauma. And one of the things that happens with trauma is like our whole understanding of how the world and safety operates just shattered.
Yep.
And so that's why with this process of atone, attune, attach, that's why like confession is one of the really critical things up front, is for a betrayed partner trying to find some safety again. One of the things that's really needed is to understand what are the boundaries around what's happened. Like if I don't have answers to what happened, when it happened, why it happened, it makes sense that I'm naturally going to want to protect myself and I'm going to generalize those things. Like the world isn't safe. Men aren't safe, right?
Right.
So really getting that honesty to be able to start that process of putting up some boundaries of like, here is where the trauma begins and here is where it ends. And I can start kind of mapping that out and understanding that those are the boundaries around what has occurred. And again, with the timeline, like it's not a rush to say, well, by this date, you need to feel safer, right? With any element that you name.
Right. Wouldn't that be convenient?
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't.
I really wonder as well is doing some individual therapy, trauma work.
Absolutely.
In addition to the couples therapy to really get through the trauma and the lack of safety that has presented itself to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say like that couples therapy is really helping work through that process of, disclosure and these other steps that we named. Individual in a lot of ways is where you're going to get the most benefit from healing from the trauma and processing like what's happened and making sense of that and helping my mind and my body to come back to a place of safety.
Yes. Do you also find that people have a hard time forgiving themselves?
Yeah.
I even the betrayed for both parties, right? I think forgiveness is an interesting thing. And I think sometimes we try to jump right to forgiveness. Like, okay, let's get rid of the messiness and let's just go right to forgiveness because that'll feel better and we'll be able to move on, right?
Yeah.
Which is obviously not what you've talked about. We need to go through the atone and attune stage, right? But forgiving not just the person who has betrayed, but the betrayed partner, I think often struggles with self-doubt.
Yeah.
Like, why didn't I see this? Why was I so blind that I didn't have any idea this was going on? And how do I trust myself it won't happen again?
Yeah.
So how do you think going through trust repair of self as well? Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's a reason that we respond that way. And it's because like feeling out of control with something is a really scary place to be. And so even if it negatively impacts our self view, we can jump to assumptions that there was something I did or didn't do, something I had or didn't have that was the cause of what happened. Like it really impacts our view of self, but at the same time, it kind of makes sense because it's like, if that's the answer, then there's something I can do to control this. Right. And so understanding that like, that's not why it happened. It's not like we can, we can, I'll share this example. One of my favorite movies, I was just asked this yesterday, actually. Somebody asked, what's your favorite movie of all time? Jurassic Park, the original.
Okay.
And one thing I love about that movie is the suspense is built by what you don't see. Like, there's not a whole lot of like the dinosaur scenes. There's not a whole lot of that footage actually on the screen. It's happening off the screen. And the reason that's so suspenseful is then your mind starts coming up with what's happening, right? Really similar with trauma. What we don't know is one of the most scary things. And in the absence of honesty, in the absence of like filling in those gaps, our mind will do it for us.
Yes.
And so we start telling ourselves this story of, well, it happened because I wasn't interesting enough to my partner, or I wasn't available enough, or our sex life was struggling, or all of that can be untrue, but it also has an element of some soothing to us because it helps us feel like we're in control in some way.
So do you think recognizing that actually that isn't ours to control?
Yeah.
Like, this is where I end and my partner begins.
Yeah.
And I actually don't have those answers, right?
Yeah.
So, but filling in those gaps is what's so important, because it does allow our mind to not have to make up things about actually what did or did not happen.
Right.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. By the way, Jurassic Park is a fantastic show. And when you said, I think it's like, you never know what's kind of coming. And I thought, well, they did a good job with the music too.
Yes,
I was like,
exactly.
every time,
Right.
you kind of anticipate that.
Yeah.
So really great. Okay. Grant, is there anything else you've shared with us some really rich, important information. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel like is important for our listeners today?
I think we've covered a lot of the nuts and bolts of the trajectory. I think maybe a minute just to kind of touch with the emotion of it all.
Okay.
It's heavy.
So heavy.
And right. And I think it's difficult sometimes to find a place that feels safe to talk about. Earlier I mentioned one of the some bad advice around it is to let bygones be bygones and leave it in the past. And I think that's unfortunately something a lot of people hear. I think especially from like pastoral counselors. So, priests
like
and bishops and rabbis, and meaning well. But it kind of, I think for somebody with this question, one of the things that's really hard is, who can I talk to? Can I talk to anybody? And you, like earlier when you mentioned kind of the forgiveness of self, I think partners feel vicarious shame too.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, I'm ashamed that this happened
Absolutely.
in our relationship, or that my partner did what they did, and so, hopefully the conversation today sheds a little bit of light, or gives people a glimmer of hope that like, this is absolutely something that you can talk about. There are safe people. And again, coming back to this, like finding a therapist that really understands it is a great place to start opening that door to being able to let out the emotion and make sense of what's happened.
Absolutely. I think what you said, the emotion behind this is such an isolating event often.
Yeah.
And so many times people don't want to talk about it. They don't want other people to know. And to try to go through this alone in isolation without support is nearly impossible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, Grant, I really appreciate your insights. I have watched you help couples through this and have been impressed, and have just watched healing take place. And so I just honor your efforts on behalf of couples that you've worked with, because it's real and it's a significant thing to help people go from such a place of shattered trust to one of repair. And just the hope that you provided that it can happen, right? Appreciate again, just as our listeners, to wrap up, the steps that are so important, atone, to really get back to safety, to make sure that everything is being laid out and that there's no time frame on that, to attune, which is to repair that connection, to attune to one another, to turn towards, and then finally that attachment and intimacy stage, and to recognize that none of those have a time frame on them, but to do them in steps and in order is really important, right? Well, for our listeners, we hope you gleaned some insights as you navigate some of these difficult challenges that can happen in life, and betrayal is certainly one of those. If you like this episode, please rate and review, and we'll see you next time.